Okay, welcome friends. I'm Piper McGinley. I'm the Associate Director of LEAD California. It's an honor to be here today to co-moderate the webinar. I'm pleased to be in conversation with our speaker, Dr. Rochelle Smarr, who has been such an active and thoughtful presence in our field for years, including prior to her doctoral work. I want to take a moment to provide some background on this webinar series for those who may not have attended a previous session. The Dissertation Dish is a collaboration between the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, or IR-SLICE, LEAD California, and GivePulse. Dissertation Dish webinars are meant for all audiences, from seasoned scholars to practitioners to graduate students. These webinars serve to highlight some of the most recent research in the community engagement field, create a way for journal editors and conference organizers to be exposed to new research and potential presenters, and offer some support and possible guidance for those of you who are in graduate programs by way of tips from those who have just gone through this experience. So far, we've hosted 11 Dissertation Dish webinars, and we've had over 800 unique individuals attend these webinars. We're excited for you to join us today as we feature the dissertation of Dr. Rochelle Smarr, Director of Experiential Learning at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Smarr will be discussing her dissertation titled Stories from the Field, Black Service Learning Student Experiences. After the presentation, my esteemed co-moderator, Dr. Marisol Morales, Executive Director of the Carnegie Elective Classifications at the American Council on Education, will facilitate a Q&A. Finally, for those of you who can stick with us past the first hour, we hope you'll join us for the informal conversation with Dr. Smarr for an additional 30 minutes. We have a few logistical items before we begin the presentation. First, we encourage you to rename yourself by clicking on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of your video image, then click rename and add your organization and/or your pronouns. We also recommend that you select speaker mode in your Zoom panel, as there are a lot of people on the call, and this will allow you to keep the speakers front and center. Third, please keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you have questions during the webinar, please go ahead and post them in the chat. We will be keeping track of your questions for the Q&A session a little later. And during the moderated Q&A session, we'll review those questions submitted via chat. Lastly, just a reminder that we are recording this webinar and it will be available within a few days on LEAD California's YouTube channel. We will send out a link once it's available. And with that, I welcome my co-moderator, Dr. Marisol Morales, to introduce herself and our Dissertation Dish speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Piper. I hope folks can see me okay. I had to join via my iPhone because I don't know what's happening with technology. So thank you, Piper, and thank you, Brian, GivePulse, and IR-SLICE for hosting this. So excited to be able to co-moderate with a good friend and colleague, Dr. Rochelle Smarr. Before I begin, I just want to state how extremely excited I am about this topic and how proud I am of Dr. Smarr and all of her hard work in this area, especially as we see more work and research on our diverse student populations. So Rochelle Smarr, Dr. Rochelle Smarr is the Director of Experiential Learning at University of California, San Diego, overseeing academic internships and the co-curricular record, a transcript of campus student activity, leadership activities. Nationally, she's been a member of IR-SLICE since 2019. She currently serves as the vice chair of the board and chair for the 2024 conference, and that will be held in San Diego. And so excited for her leadership on IR-SLICE. In 2022, she received the LEAD California Richard Cohn Award for Emerging Leaders in Community Engagement. Locally, she is an active member of the Greater Woodlawn Park, COGIC, and involved in the San Diego Organizing Project. Rochelle earned her BA in English from San Jose State University, her master's from New York University in Educational Leadership, Politics, and Advocacy. Dr. Smarr earned her latest credential, an EDD in Educational Leadership from the University of California, San Diego, and and California State University, San Marcos, a joint doctoral program. She is launching an educational podcast where she shares her experiences of being a hyphenated education leader. When not engaged in all things academia, she spends time with her family, friends, and her dog, really, Joe Biden. So with that, I will welcome Dr. Smarr to share her research with us.
Well, hello, everyone. And yes, my dog is named Joe Biden. He is 13 years old, and he is my favorite little person being. So thank you, everyone, for being here this morning, afternoon. I am just thrilled that you would join me for a snippet of my TED Talk on my research. So I hope that we can have an exciting conversation afterwards. But just know that I'm grateful that you're here. And so let's get started. So the topic of my dissertation was stories from the field, Black service learning student experiences. I defended on November 15th, 2023, and I am a product of a joint doctoral program between UC San Diego and Cal State San Marcos. And I share that because my program, where do you click it? There we go. Because my committee members come from both campuses. And so my chair is Dr. Erica Daniels from Cal State CSU San Marcos. And we were actually colleagues before she became my chair. And so it was lovely that she accepted the offer to mentor me on this journey. And then two of my committee members were actually faculty in the program that taught me. And so I had a well-rounded committee that was very supportive of this topic as well. And so here is a brief agenda of what I'll discuss in my small TED Talk about my research. I'll start with my positionality, give you a brief overview of how I understand service learning and its tenets, provide the significance of the research, and snippet of my literature review, dive into the research design, share a little bit about my data analysis, my research findings, and then try to wrap up with my assertions, recommendations, share a little bit of my emerging theory, and then conclude with my implications, limitations, and future research. And so I want to begin by sharing my own positionality in relation to this research. I am a Black service learning student. I participated in 2 service learning courses as an undergraduate at San Jose State University. And as a result of those 2 courses, I was able to revive 2 student organizations on campus, the first one being the Student Homeless Alliance, where we addressed poverty and homelessness at a shelter literally across the street from the university. And at that time, because it was the early 2000s, Hurricane Katrina also happened. And as a result of our efforts in the community, we developed the Gulf Coast Civil Works Project, where we were helping to create 100,000 jobs for New Orleans residents to rebuild for themselves after Katrina. And this picture is from us actually during our Louisiana winter, where we took an alternative winter break to New Orleans to clean up houses and neighborhoods, connect with community members, and attend rallies. And so with the help of Red Bull, we attended the Martin Luther King Jr. parade and promoted our organization, but also provided our voices as advocates for community members who lost everything. And so that experience as an undergraduate student activist, service learning participant led me to a career as a community organizer upon graduation. And so I worked with SEIU, went to grad school for 18 months, and then came back to the community and worked with Students First New York before entering higher ed as a career at City College of New York. But it wasn't until I became a director of service learning and civic engagement at San Marcos that I began my doctoral journey. And so that gives me the practitioner, leader, researcher, kind of scholar, multi-hyphenates. And then I have been a long-term member to an extent of IRSlice. But I will say, as Piper mentioned, this is a collaboration between IRSlice, Lead California, and GivePulse. And I thought about it and I was like, oh, this is like a conglomerate of all the great things that I love to do and all the great people. So I'm grateful that this has led us all to this moment to share as well. And so for me, in my research, what I really enjoyed and what I discovered is that service learning is a polysemionist term, meaning that it describes a program, a pedagogy, and a philosophy. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to really focus on service learning as a program and as a pedagogy. And as you see here, the 3 tenets it's connected to an academic course, it has a meaningful service project, and it has ongoing reflection. And as George Koob mentioned, it is a high impact practice because it's the teaching and learning practice that allows students to apply theory to practice and allow them to have transformative learning through this experience. And so the significance of this study is that there is a lot of research that service learning has a lot of salutary benefits. Being a high impact practice, that it increases students' academic success, it has increased engagement and their persistence toward graduation. However, most of the narrative is around white centered students participating in service learning, and there's not a lot of disaggregated data. And so I disaggregated the data with help of NESE, the National Study on Student Engagement, and found this data that demonstrates that Black students have participated in service learning consistently at higher rates than white peers. But you wouldn't know this if you just looked at the scholarship. So look beyond the numbers. And so this brings me to the purpose of my research, to really, truly, at its bare minimum, understand the lived experiences of undergraduate Black students in service learning courses. My guiding question was, how do Black students experience service learning courses? And then I distilled that down a little more of understanding, like, what transformative learning do Black students derive based on their service learning experience? And then what dissonance in the service learning experience do they encounter? And I'll share briefly just my literature review buckets, and happy to share with you further. And so I wanted to create a really firm foundation of my understanding of what is the current narrative of service learning. So I looked at the different definitions, and many of us are probably familiar that Kimball is often cited by many scholars, that there are over 145 terms that are used to describe service learning as an educational practice. You might be familiar with calling it community engagement, with calling it civic engagement, with calling it community service, however you deem it. As long as it has reflection, an academic course, and meaningful service, you're doing service learning. So many definitions, but this one on the screen is one that allows us to have a more collective understanding of what service learning means. And then I shared a little bit about service learning being a high impact practice. We're all very familiar that there are two pedagogical variations of service learning that were canonized mostly by Mitchell, but Rhodes in the late 90s also created critical service learning as well. And so I love this kind of quote from Jacoby about service learning as a traditional approach emphasizes service without attention to systems of inequality and critical approach. And a critical approach that is unapologetic in its aims to dismantle structures of social justice. And so are the two differentiating structures of traditional service learning and critical service learning, is that one is more emphasis on the service without attention to inequity or inequalities, whereas critical service learning really looks at those isms and those ethics of care and why we serve, how we serve, and how do we really break down systems of oppression. My latter two literature review buckets are Black community interpretations. Just wanted to see what Black communities were already doing before service learning became formalized in the academy. And so, as you know, after slavery, many Black communities were creating civic and social organizations to both educate themselves and better themselves. And a lot of that came into having a shared agenda to address social problems impacting their community. And then we know at the same time, HBCUs were also being created, and many historically Black colleges and universities still require many of their graduates to complete X amount of hours of community service before they graduate. So ensuring that the students are uplifting Black life, involved in civic engagement, and developing those leadership skills to make them a little more career ready when they graduate. And so that's the Black community interpretations of service learning. And then I looked at student of color experiences in this service, in this high impact practice. There are tons of scholarships and scholarships that look at students of color as a monolith, but they don't break down what those experiences are. But when we looked at it a little more, I found that W.E. Du Bois highlighted double consciousness and disconsciousness for students. And the disconsciousness represents white students' inability to name racism and to be aware of race's impact on their society. And then the double consciousness is for students of color because they have to construct their self and racial identity in society while contending with how others, their peers, view people of color based on their racial identities and the similarities they have with those communities being served as well. And then many of the white students in the research mentioned that they had a sense of border crossing, of going into unfamiliar territories, but curious and very exploratory, whereas students of color experienced a sense of returning home. They were familiar with these communities, whether racially or socioeconomically, directly as well. And so there was a sense of returning home, but also a fear of being outed and othered by their peers who may not be familiar with their backgrounds, because there are not a lot of conversations that center the full student experience. Most service learning courses from the research share that most service learning courses are very white-centered focus. And so we need to shift that narrative is what I discovered. And so let's talk about my research design. I chose a qualitative grounded theory design because I really wanted to highlight and center and amplify the students' stories from their own perspectives without making any assumptions or interpretations. And through the grounded theory, I was able to seek to generate and discover my own theory about why Black students participate in service learning experiences. I recruited students through a multiple of avenues. I initially started with the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities listserv, and because they have three HBCUs that are members of their association of over 150 institutions. And then I also reached out to different service learning and community engagement listservs, my networks, some of my colleagues on the call now, but also through LinkedIn is how I recruited participants. Participants had to self-identify as Black. They had to have completed a service learning course as an undergraduate and have enrolled in the course between 2017 and 2022. And I chose this 5-year period because I wanted to make sure that I captured students' experiences pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic, just to see if that would provide any other variations in their experiences. The data was collected through the eligibility questionnaire based on those questions, those criteria there. And then I scheduled semi-structured interviews with them for 60 to 90 minutes as well. Let's see. And so just to show you, the eligibility questionnaire was very short. It was comprised of multiple choice and open-ended questions that allowed me to make sure that they were eligible to participate in the survey, but also to just gather initial thoughts on what was the importance of service learning to their academics, but also what they might have known, what they wish they had known before they started. And as you can see from just these 2 of the 17 participants, a lot of the participants took great liberty in sharing about their experience in the questionnaire. And it was just a really rich discussion that I was grateful that these students allowed me to continue to probe them when they scheduled their interviews. And so I used some of the questionnaire responses into my findings as well, but it's really rich to see how students were willing to dive into and just share a snippet about their experience on the eligibility questionnaire as well. And so I was able to recruit 49 participants to complete the questionnaire. However, only 39 were actually eligible to participate. And then it really distilled down to 17 that continued to follow through to schedule an interview with me. And so I had 13 women participate and 4 men. And what I loved about doing this data analysis and just looking at the eligibility questionnaire is that they really broke down, oh, the chart's not working. Okay. Bear with me, you see the dream. So it broke down into 3 different categories. So of the group, 7 of them were current undergraduates. A few of them studying mass communications, environmental studies, and psychology. 5 of them were graduate students and working full time. So pursuing a master's in music education. 1 was in law school, 1 was in medical school, and 1 was actually a PhD scholar pursuing her Fulbright, or completing her Fulbright scholarship in Ghana at the time. And then the latter 5 were career professionals working as a wellness coach, a program associate, working at a university center for community engagement, and 1 is actually a service learning coordinator for a local nonprofit. So it was really nice to see how these individuals could shine to show the narrative about student development and their engagement and how they reflected on their service learning as well. See, there we go. And so my participants came from university locations across the US, as you can see here. A few of them were from the same universities, and so they were really great to kind of see the breakdown about their experiences, how they talked about their service learning. And it wasn't until I got into like my 4th interview that I was like, oh, some students have done international service learning experiences. And so in addition to local, regional, and statewide service learning experiences, some students actually went international, and it was actually 6 participants, with 4 of them actually going to Jamaica on the same 6-week service learning trip. As I started my semi-structured interviews and questions with them, I wanted to make sure that I got to know them. And so I just asked them, briefly share with me a word or a phrase that describes your service learning experience. And many of them took a pause, but also smiled and shared a 1 word or phrase, as you see here in this word cloud: fulfilling, enlightening, mirroring, memorable, inspirational, and reframing. And it really allowed them to dive into a story about their most transformative service learning experience as well. And what I will note is that many of the students mentioned that the community service learning portion of the service learning was the most memorable space for them. Not many mentioned the academic classes being that for them. And then for me, the data analysis was my favorite part of this whole dissertation journey, simply because I love printing things. And so I was happy to print and read and do a lot of hand coding. And so I went through 3 phases. So I want to make sure I follow the words here. So I went ahead and printed, so each participant chose their own pseudonym, or they asked me to provide one for them, which I did. And so once I had all 17 transcripts, I downloaded and uploaded them into rev.com just to have that additional accuracy beyond Zoom's transcription service they offer us. And then along with uploading to rev.com, I uploaded my researcher memo. So my initial musings, thoughts, and observations based on their conversations with me, just so I could have those initial thoughts, because I really waited until the end of all 17 interviews before I did any data analysis part. And then I created folders for each of them on box.com with a secure password and shared it with them so that they could do some member checking with both the video of the Zoom conversation, the transcript, and then my member notes to ensure that there was accuracy into how I was displaying their stories with them as well. And then once each of the transcripts were completed and given the member checking approval, I printed them to begin the 3 phases of grounded theory coding of open, axle, and selective coding. And so with the first review of the different transcripts, I did hand coding, all 17. And then the second time I hand coded them while listening to the Zoom audio to ensure that the transcript was accurate, but also that I was following along with the different nuances that come along with them sharing their experiences and developing a list of emit codes that were true to what the participants were saying based on their experience. And then I moved on to axle coding, which is where I began to take the emit codes, which were probably around 1,000 or so before I actually uploaded them into Deduce. And then I was like, Deduce is not working for me. And I moved over to Max QDA and was able to really distill those thousands or so themes into a Max QDA codebook that I printed. And as you'll see in this middle picture, I put the different strips of the codes into larger categories. And this took me a couple of weeks to do, but it's just really nice to kind of handhold the data and match it to different categories and begin to see the themes emerge. And so from the axle and open coding, it moved me over to 800 axle codes that I came up from this various hand codings that I did. And from there, I distilled it down to 21 selective codes, which led me to 4 overarching findings that I found in my research as well. And so as I was doing the data analysis, these 2 conceptual frameworks guided me in doing this research, and it made sure that I was ensuring that I made meaning of their stories using their experiences through both student voice theory and identifying those transformative learning incidences that students identified from their experience. And then how I set up my interviews and how it also relayed into my data analysis, that I used Rachel Shah's concept of a reflective storytelling framework, and I mapped it to my conceptual framework so that I was pretty not rigid, but strategic in how I was laying out both the interview to make sure that it followed the what, so what, now what framework, but that the conversations and questions I posed to them were all derived to my research questions, but also probed them to really think about critical learning moments that they had during their experiences, and making sure that I could connect them to the different theories to ensure that their voices were central to the story I would be telling for them. And so from my research findings, I had 4 key findings, overarching findings of reflection, disposition to service, kinship, and then service learning's impact on their career. I'm going to walk you through the major findings and hope that you have time to read over some of the quotes that the students gave me. But if not, I'm sure Brian and team can share a link to the slides, but also to the full dissertation for you as well. And so my first finding is one that should be no surprise, right? Reflection was very central and important to them. As an overarching finding, it really elucidates the value of taking time for students to consider intentionally what learning moments stood out to them and continue to stand out to them and carry over into their current work and experiences. And so one student I'll mention is Atticus. He shares that to expedite learning, the reflection was useful to expedite the learning he was doing in the community so that he was able to better understand his role in the community change. As an internal check or motivation of understanding, he felt like reflection was important to make sure that he was trying to make something out of the experience and not just going there and saying, I volunteered, check in a box, but also to talk to people and be able to help them that way. The sense of reciprocity that resonated with many of the participants, such as Atticus, is one that was shared multiple times. As an aspiring doctor, Atticus wanted to ensure that he learned and contributed back to the community, demonstrating his self-awareness, understanding the purpose of service learning, and the central tool of reciprocity with his community members as well. My second finding is a disposition to service. Students were predisposed to serving in their community through their prior volunteer experiences, their familial experiences. So they have aunts, uncles, or parents, or family friends that were involved in service in their local community through fraternities, sororities, churches, or community organizations that they volunteered with, that really resonated for them of like, this is just how I grew up, as Naisha shared, having a physical or mental, having family members with mental or physical disabilities, and that it just made sense for her to work at a disability advocacy center when she was in high school as well. And so one that I want to mention about this disposition of service is that a student like Celeste, where she's sharing that having been through homelessness with my family, specifically my siblings and my mom, and seeing it where I am in life right now, I've been given the opportunity to continue to help because I've already been helped. And so she's demonstrating shifting from being served, receiving social services or support, to serving in the community and being a server herself. And so when she was approached in her criminal justice course to do a service learning activity, it was a no-brainer for her to give back because she was already doing it and she knows what it's like to be on the other side. And several of my participants shared that this is where that disposition comes from, is that they were already volunteering, had done some volunteering in the community in high school with their family, or that they themselves were receiving social services at some point in their lives growing up as well. My second finding is kinship. It's this building a sense of community with individuals that they're racially and maybe socioeconomically similar with or familiar with as well. And then students also just mentioned embracing the African diaspora through racial familiarity and just wanting to uplift and care for individuals who look like themselves. One student I want to make sure that I emphasize is that Danielle shares the opportunity to simply be authentic self without having to code switch depending on who is in the classroom is a form of kinship that many other participants mentioned. It may start out, as Danielle states, as a cultural thing that we're taught more to give back to those who helped make us the way we are in our communities we live in. However, for Danielle, she states that Black service learners, they were the student who was being read to 10 years ago. And so they know firsthand how it feels to have someone who looks like them, who might understand their experiences a bit more, who is not going to judge them. Seeing their younger selves in the children and the youth they were mentoring provided them a chance to let their guards down and not overthink how their words or actions might be misinterpreted. Many of the participants went to PWIs, and so many of them were one of a few in the classroom and didn't have a lot of community on campus in their classroom conversations. And so being able to do service learning allowed them the opportunity to have that kinship, to let that guard down and to see themselves, but also to just relate to someone beyond an academic major or course that they're taking as well. And then my last finding is that service learning had a connection to their career aspirations. Many times we think of pre-professional experience being just related to just internships, but service learning is also an opportunity for students to explore and affirm their career choices and aspirations. And so for many of the participants, that is what happened for them. And so I'll share with you Gloria's quote here. I want to be a lawyer. Well, no. I will be a lawyer. I've always been a little confused on what I wanted to do. I knew how I wanted to help people. And after doing service learning and just volunteering as a whole, I knew that I had to do something that was going to move people in those ways. And that's when I came up with immigration law. So she is a student who's a part of a certificate program at her university that allowed her to opt in to make a class service learning. And so her policy course is one that she made service learning and volunteered with the local NAACP. And it really dived her into like advocacy and wanting to go into law. And then doing a little more work, she figured immigration law because she is in a border state and wants to be advocates for those coming into the country as well. And so service learning really has helped many of the students affirm what they would like to do. I even had a student who was like, nah, I don't want to work at a nonprofit. I'd like to work at a think tank, doing policy research versus being that much on the front lines. And that's the beauty of service learning, is that you're giving students these opportunities to see what are they passionate about, what are they not so sure about, and how do they make these decisions now before they enter the workforce and kind of waste a year or two in a job or career that they may not be most interested in. So many of the students appreciated service learning for that career exploration that they were able to do. And then I wanted to make sure that I made a connection of my findings to existing theory, which leads me to my emerging theory. And so we all know the service learning tenets and benefits and values that service learning currently is always purported to in our research, in our scholarship, that it's tied to academic success, student engagement on and off campus has increased, and there's a huge persistence toward graduation. However, you don't see any of my findings in most of the scholarship we read. And so where I did see my findings is with critical service learning. And so I mapped my findings to Dr. Mitchell's critical service learning components and connected them here, as you'll see on this chart, because it made sense to me that Black student service learning experiences are different than those that we normally hear in the narrative or we read about in the scholarship as well. And so that leads me to my emerging theory that Black service learning students participate in service learning at higher rates due to their disposition to service, their kinship connection to the community, service learning's connection to their career aspiration, and that reflection deepens their post-graduation preparedness and competitiveness. Like they see the value in serving in their community, and thus they are able to really tune in and hone in more quickly and more succinctly into doing service learning as beneficial for them. And so I have a couple assertions, but I also am mindful of my timing. And so I will run through these and just offer up some questions if you have, or be open to questions at the end. So my first assertion based off my research question, my overarching research question, is that we have to value Black students' disposition to service and their prior experience. There's no longer a space for us to be naive that students are coming in with no experience. They're volunteering. It's what they're doing with their community, with their family, and it may not be always tied to academics, but we know most students have to come to college with some pre-experience. So why are we continuing to approach these courses as so naively and so from ground zero, whereas we can invite them into the conversation? So I suggest in my recommendations that we acknowledge and incorporate students' prior service learning experience, validate their disposition to service, because a lot of students just have the compassion and it's in their character want to serve and give back, and leverage it for peer-to-peer discussion so that these hard or difficult conversations don't happen in the community, but they're happening in an academic space so that students can agree to disagree in a way that's useful and not discouraging while they're out in the community at a site of some sort, which happened to a couple of my participants. My second assertion based on my sub-question is we need to value the variety in service learning courses and program modalities that benefit students of color. I certainly went into my research study thinking that service learning has to be just tied to one academic course, one meaningful community partner, and ongoing reflection has to happen all from that one faculty member. Well, that was blown out the water because there's so many different varieties that a center for community engagement on the campus can be a reflection intermediary, be a community partner, connector for the faculty and for the students, that a certificate can also encourage students and be an incentive for them to want to do community engagement. And so there are a variety of ways that we can institutionalize it and that we can support students to, as my colleague Luke told me the other day, like that students can just like bump into community service across campus, that it's not a huge requirement, but it's just something we do. It's in the ethos. And so there are many ways that we can make sure that every student is having a transformative learning experience, especially for Black students to be validated and that this is something that we do and it can be of value to them in their career. My third assertion is connected to the dissonance in service learning that Black students encounter. And not many of my participants shared much dissonance, but the ones that didn't allow that to deter them. And so Black students persist past any minor dissonance they might have in their service learning experience with faculty not being aware of their positionality, of their whiteness of an extent, and then peers being kind of ignorant to what it means to be working in these communities that look like them. And so my recommendations are to employ a critical service learning pedagogy intentionally from the start. And that can be in the research, in the readings, and the assignments, just ensuring that we're having these conversations in the classroom that allow them to take a more critical lens about why they're serving, who they're serving, and what their role is in creating social change. And then elevating community voices in courses and projects, invite partners in. Students appreciate seeing themselves with the leaders of the community service projects and hearing their side of it, instead of waiting until they're at the project and doing that kind of awkward, cold conversation. And then faculty scholarship that's connected to community partnership, still very much seeing that when faculty have their own relationship with a community partner and their own passion to a social justice issue, it just lands differently with students. They see the purpose of it and the value of it more than it just being I'm volunteering as a requirement of this course, but it's really toward a larger social goal as well. And then my limitations is that the Black identity is not a monolith. I love that many of my participants said that they were Black and I really want to figure out how to explore that and how their various identities impacted or enhanced their experience. There's also a variety of service learning experiences that are happening, and then none of my participants were from HBCUs. So there's that fun, working on it. And then leadership and social justice implications, just incorporating more culturally relevant community engagement pedagogy, considering critical race theory and service learning scholarship, and then validating Black service learning experiences on a broader scale, because when we do, it might ripple effect into more students participating as well. Sorry. My future research, as you see here, is just kind of continuing this conversation around stories of the field and looking at Latinx students, because they're the #2 group of students that are participating in high numbers in service learning. I really want to examine the HBCU experience with service learning, and then investigate a little further about Black student motivations with service learning as well. And then I think that's it, folks. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thanks, Rochelle. First, congratulations. I'm really so proud of your research and so interested in talking more about it during the time that we have together and facilitating the questions part. You know, I will say, like, I feel like you and I need to do a piece together, because this reminds me a lot of you know, my dissertation work looking at Latinx students and where there's the overlaps between. And so I would love to figure out an opportunity for us to kind of talk more, because I do think you're right. Most of the literature that's out there, the way it shows up is our students are really not doing it. But when you look at the numbers, you see we're doing it at our participation rates are higher. So I guess I'll get us started while we're waiting for some questions to come in. But sort of what made you want to explore this, aside from kind of your own, you know, kind of experience, and then what shocked you from like what you discovered?
What really made me, well, first, let me say, I definitely want to write a paper with you or a piece, because I certainly looked at yours as I was drafting mine. So thank you. What made me want to do this research is that I just got tired. Because when you're in the higher science world and in these conversations, you know that Black students are involved in this work. You know that we're having meaningful experiences, but it just seemed like it was like the same 4 or 5 authors and the same 5 or 10 articles that was being mentioned. And I just wanted to disrupt it. And I wanted to add my 2 cents to say that there's more, and hopefully open the floodgates for more people to look ethnically at student experiences. I'm sure they're not going to be grand differences among their experiences, but I know for me, in 2006, I would have loved to have seen an article that shared another Black student's experience. So I think about Gabrielle Hickman at Cornell, when she wrote that kind of op-ed about her experience. It was like, you can do that. You can share. This is great. And coincidentally, she was the first student who told me, like, I'm happy they hired a person of color into this office. And I was like, never thought about my positionality that way either. And so I think I just kept kind of those little gem moments about wanting to do that. And then what surprised me is that so many of the students value reflection sooner than I did as a student. I think it took me until I was in grad school. I was like, oh, I think reflection is a thing. I think the what, so what, now what is something that I incorporate into most of the work I do. But to see a freshman at USC in her 2nd semester have such a handle on critical reflection that she's mentoring other students, like, oh, how do we get more students to replicate the importance of reflection and not just jumping in and doing everything, but making sure that they're just thinking a little more critically about why they're doing it and how that is shown up in their practice and in their everyday life. I think it's such an essential skill that we don't always put enough emphasis on it for development.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're so right. You know, I often say with the work we do with campuses, like, we ask our students to reflect, but we're not taking the time to reflect and thinking about, like, how do you build that in, especially when you move to the practitioner side of the house, when you're trying to get everything done. And, you know, it seems like those students reminded you the importance of that space, right, for transformation. I think we're still waiting for a question to come in. But I've got some more. So I'm wondering where, so you said none of your students came from HBCUs. Did you have any that were at HSIs or other kind of minority designated institutions? And did you see any difference between those students and students who are at PWIs?
Ooh, that is a good question. I did not. I think they were all pretty much from PWIs. MSIs were the four. So four of the students were from an MSI. But I didn't think too much to think about like looking at this universities that way. I just knew I had my list of HBCUs and I was like, they're not on there. So they must all be PWIs, but that's a point I can come back to.
That'll be for our piece together.
Okay. Good.
So I've got some questions and I'll sprinkle these in as more come in as well.
I think Shelby had her hand up, but I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Uh-oh.
I can't see because I'm on my little phone, but we
We can
have
do the sorry, we can do the unmuting part in the second half of the Q&A. I think Shelby wanted to come off mute, so for this one we'll just stick to the ones coming in through the chat.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say. So we can have a question from Matthias and ask, what do you find from the international service learning, from your international service learning experience? How US Black students experience their identity in a sense of going home or otherness? Considering your critical perspective, what did you find in terms of dismantling structures of oppression at the international level? So for those students who did international service learning, you know, where did you find some of this maybe cross-border dismantling of structures of oppression come up?
This is an excellent question. And I feel like it came up with the students who went to Malaysia and Bali. And so two Black women as upperclassmen went to these different spaces. And the biggest way that they were dismantling systems of structures of oppression was that they took it upon themselves to not come in the very American way of like, we are coming in to teach you, we're coming in to lead you, we have all the answers. They very much met up with their classmates before they got on the plane to say, we are going in to learn from these individuals in these communities. And I think they were both indigenous communities, and we don't want to come in like the experts. We don't want to come in and just blow through our agenda and forget that these are people whose lives were essentially interrupting for our agenda to share out our service and to gain something to learn. And so I think that was, to me, the biggest structure, is that they had been participating in service learning long enough to know that that's traditionally sometimes the way we approach this work, but they want to do it differently in an international context. And in doing so, they were so embraced by the community that both of them mentioned that community members were fighting at the end of saying, this is my daughter, this is my child, we're staying in touch. They were very much a part of the community. And so a few of them still stay in touch through WhatsApp and have actually taken trips to go back and meet the communities because they've actually built a bond. And that, to me, is how they created those authentic relationships that we're not just dropping in for a short period of time and hoping to make the biggest impact, but it's really about the people's lives you're impacting, but also how they're impacting you too. And so I think for the both of them, that's one way I can see how they didn't experience an otherness. They felt embraced. And even the students that went to Jamaica, they're just like, yeah, of course, the Jamaican students, joked with us and said that we were Oreos because we didn't play soccer, but at the same time, we had an opportunity to connect through music, through culture, through community, just beyond our skin tone. And they really felt like home in these spaces. Whereas sometimes when you're just going down the street, you can still feel kind of other because you're in this big academy and there's all these assumptions and stereotypes about you're going to this great school, like you should be this way. And so these international communities really embrace them in ways that they weren't expecting. But in turn, they fully embraced and they fully valued and cared for. So.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Thank you. So we have a question from Tim Bryson. How did your dissertation process inform and or confirm your practitioner philosophy working with students?
Ooh, it totally confirmed for me as a practitioner that we have to include student voices. I have learned that as I move up in my little world that I can't not have student staff around me, that I cannot continue to be in spaces that don't allow me to check in with students, don't allow me to observe, or allow me to an extent, just a very little extent to mentor and ensure that I'm relating to them and just making sure that they're central to what we do. We all say we're student-centered. Of course we can be student-centered. We're working on university. But what does that look like in practice? And so for me, it's having a student advisory board. It's making sure that I have student staff that I check in with on a daily basis, or if not every other day. But it's also just making sure that I'm not just looking at the scholarship to inform the programs and practices I'm creating, but that I'm checking in with them as well. And that I'm also holding my staff and my colleagues accountable to doing the same thing, because we can't do this work for the students of old of the early 2000s, when we know that the students we're encountering now are coming out differently from the pandemic. And so we have to shift. I used to be the same person, stand on my soapbox and say, when I was in school, I worked 2 jobs and I did service learning and I worked and did that. Like, that was great for you and your experience, but that's not the same for these students today. And so we have to be mindful of how we're doing that. And I think from this experience, it just lets me know, like, these are whole students that have so many stories and experiences they're bringing in class or bringing to different spaces, and that it takes 2 minutes to ask them about themselves, to genuinely ask about their experience and what they're coming from and how they relate to this work. And so it's something that I'm trying to remind myself to pause and do, because you get so caught up in the rat race that you don't think to do that. But that is one thing that has informed the work that I've done.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it leads nicely into this next question that we have from Harold. They share, it seems like using a definition of service learning that excludes co-curricular and extracurricular experience works against the goal of better acknowledging students' prior engagement. How might we as a field better utilize and incorporate broader, more inclusive terms, definitions to appreciate students' prior experience in the community? Is there a particular term folks use that does this effectively?
Ooh, this is a good one. And I would say, Harold, you put me in a good spot, because my role currently is experiential learning. And so for me, that's the broad enough term that allows us to do both curricular and co-curricular. I just think for me, and this is me in my own little soapbox, that service learning is normally attached to academics, but it can happen in the co-curricular space. It happened in some of the programs we did at Cornell. It happened when I was at City College with the Partners for Change scholarship. And it can happen in any ways. I'm just saying that when we do this, can there be a course component? Can there be a couple of series or workshops that allow the students to be grounded in what they're doing, versus just saying, oh, you want to do the certificate? Just jump out there, do your 100 hours, we'll come back and we'll sign off on it. I think we need to make sure that there's a structured learning opportunity for students to ensure they know why they're serving, who they're serving with, and what the true hope is for them to take away from it. And I do think that there is a broader term. I think we just use community engagement. And community engagement, it has its varieties and its facets, and it's a big umbrella that many of us aspire to. I think the technical term of service learning is what we use in scholarship to really call out the work we're doing specifically around the faculty and student teaching and learning method that we employ. So I think that answers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like there's been some evolution in that too. And Rochelle, I guess as a follow-up, did you dig more into like the ways that it was structured at the institutions that students were at? Like, did the institutions have centers for service learning, or was it like faculty leading it? Do you have some of that information as well?
I do. And so most of the students at the traditional service learning where it was a faculty member who had a community partner and they connected them there. But the one that surprised me the most is that a faculty member was like, for extra credit, you can do service learning. Go to the Center for Community Engagement, sign up for a project, connect it back to the course, write a paper for me and for them. And ta-da, you get service learning and extra credit courses. There was also a certificate that students could partner with the Center for Community Engagement and identify classes they would like to do a service project with. And so they had to get both the faculty approval and the center approval, and then to do service learning as a additional assignment to whatever the faculty members require them to do as a deliverable. And many students did it because it allowed them to graduate with distinction, but it allowed them to choose what courses they wanted to make community engagement and service learning as well. And then the traditional service learning kind of alternative rate, like the 6 to 8 weeks in Jamaica, and a few students, like I mentioned, went to Malaysia. So I definitely looked into different models of what service learning can be composed like, and I think we shouldn't be stuck to one. I think we can do multiple. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So this comes from KO. How can we bridge the gap of understanding of academic service learning for high school students?
Ooh. How can we bridge the gap
of understanding academic service learning for high school students?
How do we bridge the gap for academic service learning for high school students? I feel like it's the same. There's no real gap, unless I'm misunderstanding, because if they're service learning, it has those 3 tenets. And so unless maybe students in high school do like 400 hours, it's an exorbitant number that most students probably have to do. But it should be the same structure of a faculty member doing some community service volunteering, and then the reflection as well, and then just transitioning into college. I don't know, maybe you can tease out that question a little more.
Yeah, I can jump in. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I can rephrase the question as how can we, so I feel like a lot of students that come to college, they come up to surprise of understanding what academic service learning is. So I think my question is more so catered towards when they are in high school is there a way for them to have a better understanding of the importance of community service or service learning and how that is integrated in college?
Okay, I understand your question better now. So normally in high school, from my understanding, is that students are doing a lot of volunteer hours. Not a lot of them are attached to an academic course or a fellowship or a program or a person that's just guiding them through that process to consider the what, so what, now what of the process of learning. And so when they get to college and they're like, you have to do this class on Monday, Tuesdays, and on Fridays, you have to go out and do community service learning. It's just like a big disruptor of like, what? I thought I was just here to do this one thing for these couple of hours. And so I think what we need to figure out with our K through 12 colleagues is how do they begin to really restructure students having these high numbers of volunteer hours, but creating programs, creating certificates, creating cohorts of students that can go through the education and learning process collectively so that they're not just volunteer to be a really great candidate and put it on their application. Because I have a niece that's still finishing her volunteer hours. I'm like, but you've been accepted into school. Like, why do you still need to do this thing? And she can't tell me why, because there's no program that's attached to her doing these hours. And so I think that might be the gap, is that there's no real learning outcome for students to do a bunch of these volunteer hours. And so when they get to college and they're asked to do it in addition to academic credit hours, it can be a little jarring for them. But it's also on the faculty member in the beginning of those first 2 weeks and not the first day of saying this class is service learning, this is how it's structured. But they have to actually walk them through what it looks like and break it down for them, and then just do breadcrumb reminders of how this is different from what they might be used to. Check in with them about how they're making the adjustment and how they can flex their hours and their work week time to make sure that they can incorporate it. But it's a part of the conversation that we need to be having with students versus assuming they haven't done service learning, or that they've done a little bit, or this is just completely new. So I think it's a part of that onboarding and learning that we need to give ourselves when we're so versed in the field of like, everyone just knows what I'm talking about. But I can tell you today, my parents don't know what service learning is. So I got to slow down and mention it to them. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
We have 2 questions that I want to make sure we get to. So Victoria says, I've looked at the historic and SE data and noticed the same thing, that students of color are participating in this high impact practice at higher rates. Why do you think that traditional narrative of non-participation continues to persist?
Because the same scholars beat us to the punch of writing. That's what it is. I think because this is true. I think the same scholars are continuing to write with the same lens and the same focus. And, they're really great people. Met a few of them through some of these fun things we do in our world, but they're not the only ones who can write. I think we need to figure out a way to support scholars of color to write more fervently and in more ways in different spaces and places so we can change that narrative. But also in our different spaces to realize that students of color are participating at higher numbers, right? But they're in smaller blocks. And so what I noticed when I was looking at NESI is that it's across the US. And so it's not one college that has like 150 Black students. It's like 25 to 50. But as you come together, it's like really large numbers. And so that's why it's a larger number. And it's just thinking about how we change the narrative, but also how we change the practice, and how do we enable practitioners to say, when you're doing your outreach and your promotion, when you're partnering with faculty members, how do you highlight the student of color experience versus just the white student experience? How do you decenter it so that all students' voices are centered and recognized over others? But if you're a scholar, if you're a practitioner, I would say, join these writing boot camps and get your scholarship out there, write a blog post, come to our conferences and present. But there's little subversive ways that we can begin to change the narrative. And we have to all collectively do it versus sitting back and letting the well-known trailblazers do it.
Yeah, I mean, I also think we need to push our journals to ensure higher participation rates. So like I consistently ask, what's your disaggregated demographic data of, folks who you're publishing in your journals. And so I think that there's multiple ways for us to push it, both in terms of like the scholars themselves and creating opportunities, but then also like the places that are publishing. Okay, we will finish with this question for, I think, this part of our Q&A. So Keith says, excellent presentation and glad you've been able to center these experiences. Did you come across much research as it relates to Black students' experiences in HBCUs versus at PWIs? It seems like the dynamic might be very different as Black students would be navigating not only the service experience, but also the code switching around white students.
So this is a little bit about what Marisol and I were talking about, connecting our research. But I did some research and I found some articles about the HBCU experience, and Black students just have a higher self-efficacy when they're around themselves and see their community. And so I think that is going to be the difference around being at PWIs, where you have to create your own affinity groups and do resource centers of the sort. But I'm sure that if we tease out the data a little more about code switching, yes. It's not to say that my research was hindered, but I had to choose not to go into critical race theory where I could look into this a little deeper. Because if you know anything about dissertation, a done dissertation is a good dissertation. And so
Right.
I had to get it done. But that is like the part 2 that I'm looking at, because if you look closely at one of my slides, you'll see that I had about 500 codes that I had to white out, simply because a lot of my students talk about race. And that to me is the part 2 that I hope to examine, and maybe to tease out and looking at the HBCU versus PWI experience as well. But it's an excellent question and hope to come back to it soon.
Great. We actually got a couple more. So are there any specific university courses that offer service learning? Can any professor offer them?
Ooh, any professor can offer them. You just got to be willing to make those community partnerships first and foremost on your own. It's something that I'm really a champion of, is instead of relying on a community center to do it for you or a practitioner to do it, is that you yourself as a faculty member create those partnerships and then bring it to the university to establish an MOU and then tie it into your curriculum from there collectively together. But any course can be service learning. If you Google 100 service learning courses, you'll see it. There's so many fashions of it as well.
Okay, and then the last one, a question we asked ourselves at my DePaul University in Chicago: what are some best practices for preparing students to enter the service learning experience in communities, confronting biases, approaching from a serving with versus serving for ABCD Institute? Some have kinship or connection to the communities, but for the others, open to all answers. So in terms of like to prepare students,
I think preparing students is essential. And the best way I can think of is that what we did at Cornell is like doing those kind of pre-engagement workshops where we had students do their own kind of cultural identity pie about what they're bringing into the community, what are their biases, what are their blind spots, and then mentioning to students about what it means to work with community. Like there's a difference of working in community and working with, and using some reciprocity as well. There are tons of articles and activities you can do, but I do think just having an open conversation is useful. And then having them do think, pair, shares with each other to say, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm worried about, how can we help and support each other, to be accountable to being authentic in these different spaces collectively. But this is a great question, and one that I would love to come back to, but I welcome any other responses. Just for some reason drawing a blank. Apologies, but yeah. Put that open. Yeah. Yes.
All right. So I'm going to jump in. Thank you so much, Rochelle and Marisol, for a thoughtful presentation on your dissertation, along with fostering a great discussion with our audience. This concludes the moderated Q&A session, but we still have another 30 minutes for a deeper discussion, but we recognize that not everyone has the time or ability to stay on. Before we transition, just a couple of reminders. We are recording this webinar and it will be available in the next few days on the Lead California YouTube channel. We will send out a link to all the registrants once it's available. There will be a follow-up email from GivePulse coming to you today with a link to a webinar evaluation. And please take some time to give us some feedback. We're excited to announce our next Dissertation Dish webinar. It will be on August 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern and feature Dr. Carmen Monge Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez's dissertation research title is The Latin American University and Society: Analysis of the Relationship between University and Community from the Capabilities Approach for Human Development. And it will be the first bilingual dissertation dish that we've hosted. And more details in the registration link will be emailed to all who registered for this webinar. So we're going to go ahead and stop the recording, and